Hey, Sam, give me a thumbs up when you're ready on your end. Good to go? All right. Hey, good evening, and welcome to Calvary Chapel here in Santa Barbara. I'm Dr. Dave Newton, and we're doing 3 special sessions on apologetics. I have 2 of my good colleagues here with me for these sessions. Dr. Travis Dickinson is a professor of philosophy and apologetics at Dallas Baptist University, and then Dr. Todd von Helms is a senior scholar at a couple other schools where he's doing contributing writing and speaking on many topics. And many of you will know if you have the apologetics books, the foreword on the front is from Dr. Todd von Helms, so you've probably had a chance to read him before. So we're glad to be here this evening. We're going to just jump right in and get into our topic for this evening. So what is apologetics? The Greek term apologetics simply means a reasoned argument or a good defense. This is a shot of me up on the Acropolis there at the Areopagus, the Mars Hill, just south of the Acropolis in Greece, in Athens. And the Acts chapter 17 is actually inscribed on a placard right there leading up to the Areopagus with Paul's argument in his defense of the unknown God to the Stoics and Epicureans. And so we want you to be well equipped. 1 Peter 3:15 says, you should always be ready to give a good apologia, a good reasoned argument for the hope that's within you. And there's a comma right after that, and it says what? But with gentleness and reverence. So it's not about having a screaming, yelling debate with somebody. So our caveat for this evening is always going to be number 1, it's very rare that in a first conversation with a skeptic that you're going to change their mind because you have an amazing argument for your position. You don't want to get into a major argument, of course. Gentleness and reverence. And number 2, always remember, as soon as we're done this evening, know that if we brought 3 other people up here from the other side, they would literally say everything the 3 of us presented is nonsense. And because they have an entirely different position. You have to understand the lines have been drawn. Okay, there is 2 very different views. What we want to do is equip you to not feel intimidated when somebody seems to speak from a position of authority and you feel like, well, how do you respond to that? And you'll find tonight, most of, if not all of what we discuss is not going to be from the Bible. We're going to be talking about apologetics and defense of the faith, really from classical, logical, common sense, rational argument, okay? So here's a couple of books, good resources. These are from Travis. These are on the resources page at the end, and everything's being recorded. You can always go back and look at these later. Everyday Apologetics is a nice one. If you go to his website, you can actually get that as a free download to you as a PDF, just for registering at his site, which is nice. And then this is the first book in my apologetics series on the Worldview. And Worldview is the lens through which you see things, okay? Guys, what's your comments about worldview?
Yeah, one thing that I would say about apologetics especially, and then get to worldview, is that what I think we need to do as Christians, honestly, is be curious. We need to be more curious and just ask our questions. We're often kind of afraid to do that, I think. I definitely sort of grew up not being encouraged. In fact, if anything, I was encouraged to not ask questions, like knock it off with all the questions kind of thing. And I really think that apologetics just should flow from that sort of curiosity where we're just trying to figure it out. Another great passage that I think reflects this is where Jesus says, as a matter of the greatest commandment, like the most important thing for us to do is to love the Lord our God with all of our hearts, souls, and our minds. Which, again, I that's not always the way in which I think we are as Christians. Like, we're not always loving God with our mind. Like, we might worship Him passionately and emotionally and with our hearts and so on. But just to ask questions, not as skeptics, like not as someone that's trying to sort of disprove God or trip Him up in some way or whatever, but just because we want to know God in a deeper kind of way, that we would ask these questions and love Him with our minds. And then worldview is so important that we are just, right, we've got to get to that level where we're really questioning the way in which we approach the world. So I'll give just a quick analogy of what I think a worldview is, because I think a lot of people don't even realize they have a worldview. So I grew up in New Jersey. Dave
Yeah.
and I are New Jersey.
Yes. Another Jersey guy.
Yeah. So forgive us for that. No. But I grew up thinking I didn't have an accent. Right? There's a pretty strong New Jersey accent, if you've ever heard it. I think I've lost it, to be honest, a little bit. But I went off to college, and I came back, and I thought, man, why is everybody talking so funny? The reality is that we all have an accent, even if we don't realize we have an accent. And it takes getting amongst other people sometimes to sort of surface, to be able to hear that accent. I think the same with worldviews. We all have worldviews. We all do. We all have these commitments of our hearts, this sort of orientation. James Sire is a great figure to read on worldview. He describes it as an orientation of our hearts. It's these fundamental commitments that we have of how we see the world. And as Christians, right, we ought to have a Christian worldview. I think it takes asking the deep and difficult questions to really surface and have a robust worldview in that sense.
Yeah, I would agree.
Todd?
I would agree completely, and I think it's important to know that it's, when you walk inside the doors of this church, that you're at a place where it's okay to not be okay, and that God really does love and cherish each one of us.
Yep.
And when we can learn to love Him with our mind, as you mentioned, which sometimes we neglect and don't do, that's an act of worship in itself. And to look even at apologetics as an act of worship, in that you're creating spaces by which anyone can come and express those doubts and say, hey, I don't have it figured out. And when I see people that oftentimes we put on pedestals say, you know what, I don't know, I'm not sure, I think that's really healthy, because it opens that door to have the conversation, to really dig deeper. And a lot of times when I travel the country and speak to young people, and the quote up here, the one about biblical literacy being rare, those of you that maybe were alive 20, 30, 40 years ago, there was a starting point, a biblical framework, a vernacular, a language by which people understood basic concepts because of Sunday school and things like that. But nowadays, they don't, I can say, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, or Romans 1, God's made it, plain to them through general revelation, and things that really matter. But for a lot of the younger people, or those even in society that don't know the scriptures, they just look at you and go, what is that? Or I don't believe the Bible you're using to defend your position. And so when I met Dave years ago, and even with this Figure It Out series, when we started talking about it, and he said, invited me to maybe write the foreword, at first I thought, that's really fascinating that you're not really quoting scripture or using much, certainly early on. And I think what you're going to see tonight is that a great starting point for anyone that would look at you quoting scripture and just say, I don't believe that, I don't care, I don't think it's true. God has revealed Himself through His creation, and many of the things we're going to be seeing, that is a common starting point by which from there you just pique an interest or curiosity to where they can then start asking the questions and then realize, wow, maybe there is a grand artist or designer behind it.
Absolutely. So when we think about it, tonight's session gets into this idea of worldview. Worldview is a lens through which you see things. How do you perceive the world and everything going on around us? And there are competing worldviews. And I would argue, from my own position, everybody has their own, but I would say that there are really only two worldviews. There's either a worldview that everything you see around you came from accident, random chance, no intention, no purpose. It's all just because of random circumstances in a wild universe with no God, no creator, just accidental. Or there's intention. There's purpose, there's design, there's intent, and there is a creator. And so as we look at competing worldviews, one of the first big things for worldview is this issue of proving that God exists. And one thing I would encourage you is when you're having a conversation with someone who is going to argue very hard for, I don't believe in God, always remember that the other side, the skeptic, has not yet been able to prove that God does not exist. Always remember that. They always put the burden on you as the believer. Why don't you prove to me that God exists? And yet they have no burden on them to say, well, let me show you, I can guarantee you and prove that God does not exist. And so always be encouraged by that. And tonight we want to give you some practical, really good responses that you can have. And certainly we can't cover everything in 3 days. or in one evening tonight. But we can point you in a direction. Hopefully you'll read more on this. You'll look at some good resources that are out there, and you can really grow in your ability to do this. So the naturalist worldview, guys, is there's no God. What you want to, Travis, tell us a little about what that worldview looks like.
Yeah, so on the naturalist, it's sometimes called materialist, atheistic view, right? That really all that exists are just the physical, material, natural objects of the world. So from the universe, it's big cosmic size, but also down to you and I. So that all you and I are really are physical, material, natural things that are functioning. So there's a philosopher, actually California philosopher, I believe. I think he's San Diego, but Paul Churchland, who says he thinks that we need to get rid of these words like love, right? Because they really don't pick out anything. And as the science advances, we'll just stop using these words, and instead of like, I love you, baby, to your special one, you'll say neuron number 47 is really firing for you, baby. Right. So I mean, that's kind of like, that's a pretty extreme view. So I'm not trying to say that every naturalist or physicalist, materialist would hold to that, but that is kind of that direction, is just to say that's what the world is. The world is all and only material, and you and I, all we are. So all love is just brain chemistry and neural firings, right? Whereas, as we'll contrast it, but anyway, that's the naturalist worldview.
And remember, in the naturalist worldview, you didn't come from anywhere. There's no purpose. It's just accidental, random chance over billions of years. Just things started to happen and evolution took place, and you just happened to be where we are today. And in that case, there's really no purpose to life. There's no purpose to anything. Survival of the fittest, all those kinds of things you hear about. And that's really the naturalist worldview. But we want to contrast that with a Christian biblical worldview. And that opens the door for an extratemporal designer creator who everything we see around us reflects design, intention, purpose, creativity. And the question is, which is the more logical argument of the two? Todd, why don't you comment just quickly? I mean, what do you think about the biblical Christian worldview?
Well, I think the ramifications of each one. If you take the previous with the naturalist worldview, and there's we're just products of natural selection, and there's no soul, there's no afterlife, there's no God. You can see if you adopt that principle, how euthanasia, assisted suicide for elderly people, or even abortion, it just becomes transactional. You can say, oh, well, the person shouldn't have had the kid. It was, let's just abort them. No big deal. It doesn't matter, because if that human being, if that child or the elderly person is just the product of, these randomly selected molecules that come together and there's no soul, then why should I care, right? However, if you take a biblical worldview, that each one of us is created in God's image, that we're intricately made, that I knew you before you were born in Psalm 139. Before a word was on your tongue, I know what you would say. Each one of our days are numbered, and God knows each one of them and where we'll be, where your child will go to college, where you'll be next year. And you contrast that in that each person, Jesus says, love your enemies. Well, it's hard to even love other Christians sometimes. But yet if I see everyone as being made in God's image with the biblical worldview, I'm going to all of a sudden try to see them the way that God sees them, and hopefully demonstrate a patience and a care and a concern to where I look at them as being valuable.
And interestingly, always remember that the naturalist worldview would immediately bristle up against that as being, that's philosophical. It's the meta component. All there is the physical world, and we're just here by accident. And you're adding all these additional constructs, things like love and caring, and why should you worry about, whether a baby is aborted or somebody is euthanized, or why should you care about murder? Why should you care about anything? Because we're just natural selection in a natural world. And yet, when we talk about a biblical Christian worldview, that's really separate from just simply a theistic view. Always remember, some people say are you a theist? Are you in theism, or are you more naturalist? Remember, theism by itself could be pantheism, polytheism, other kinds of religious documents that could be the basis. in Buddhism or Hinduism about the origins and things. So what we really want to talk about is a biblical Christian worldview, and it's based on the scriptures. And so as we get into this topic tonight, just picture for a moment, just planet Earth, one planet in this solar system, and we're going to talk about just how it's finely tuned and how it's designed, and from a Christian biblical worldview, we're saying there's this incalculable intelligence out there that spoke it all into being, and everything we see reflects that kind of person in the creation, and it should actually have us be in awe. And so everybody asks about the question about incalculable intelligence. Well, in the 1975 movie Sleeper with Woody Allen, there's the famous quote where Woody Allen is commenting on, do you think there's intelligent life in the universe? And he says, I think there is intelligent life, except for certain parts of New Jersey. And so we can say that because that's us, but think about that for a moment. Incalculable intelligence, what does that look like? What we're really getting at is the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. And the question is, are they compatible with each other? What do you think about that, Travis?
Yeah, I think that we have to, in a way. Privileging one of those to the neglect of the other two, I think is a mistake, honestly. And so oftentimes the naturalist will privilege science to the neglect of philosophy, right? And coming as a philosopher, I'll try to argue against that in some ways, but yeah, I think that's a mistake. Like, I think you'll have an incomplete view of the world if you privilege science over all the others. But I also think if we privilege theology above all the others, I think a lot of Christians will make that mistake. And I certainly would have done that at a certain point where we just kind of close our ears and close our eyes. We don't want to, we're worried about this kind of thing. We don't want to have anything to do with it. But I think we have to have this complementary view such that all of these domains give us this, picture of the world, a worldview, that they all figure in. They need to.
Because when you think about a naturalist worldview, I always use this as a great example. The 1987 post-punk band, The Godfathers from the UK, had a classic song called Birth, School, Work, Death. And when you think about it, that's a pretty bleak commentary on what you can look forward to in life. And yet that's what they were singing about. And they were just a bunch of angry Brits, with this great rock song. But think about the lyrics of that. Birth, school, work, death. That's all there is. I mean, in a naturalist worldview, there's no purpose to life. You came about through random chance, probabilities over billions of years. There's no intention. Why would you care about anything? Because you're really just an accident on an accidental planet in an accidental solar system, along an accidental sun, just scattered throughout a random universe that came about from a big bang. Why in the world would you have any other concerns about people or yourself or wondering about things? So that's really at the heart of it, is that there's really no meaning to life as we know it. So one of the first things we want to jump into, now what's great is Travis and I come from two different positions, although we agree very strongly, of course, in the Christian apologetics positions, but he's a philosopher, I'm a finance professor, and a guy who teaches econometrics and forecasting. And so for me, I find one of the best ways to evaluate the naturalist worldview is from the standpoint of just running the numbers. Always be aware that whenever you're dealing with somebody who's a skeptic, they will throw out blanket statements like, well, we all know evolution is the way it is, and we all know this. And you have to slow down for a second and pull that apart. For instance, let's do some basic stats. What's the probability of winning the Powerball? It's 1 in 293 million. Okay, that's your chance. Some of you are saying, dang, I bought 5 tickets today. Okay, so 1 in 293 million. Okay? Some might say, yeah, but you still have a chance. You still have a chance. How about, what's the chance that your DNA is exactly the same as someone else's? Okay? Well, it's about 1 in 8 billion, because they now recognize that there is no overlap between two individuals. It's a unique marker, unique to you. And so when we look at statistics, one of the things we're going to come up with is, remember these two numbers. Just put these in your mind if you don't remember anything else tonight. Maybe this will be one of them. The generally accepted age of the universe today, in 2025, and has been for about a couple decades, is 13.8 billion years. And that is 4.352 times 10 to the 17th seconds. That's how many seconds are in 13.8 billion years. So try to grasp that for a moment. There's about 4.5 times 10 to the 17th seconds in 13.8 billion years. The reason I go with this is because that becomes our marker, our level, if you will, when we look at the probabilities for things happening by chance. There's only 13.8 billion years. There's only 10 to the 17th seconds in the entire universe. What if things come out to be higher than that? That would mean that they would have to have random processes, just accidental things happening at a pace of more than once per second in order for them to happen. Do you get that? Does that make sense? No? Okay, think about this. 13.8 billion years is 4.2 times 10 to the 17th seconds. That's a number with 17 zeros after it. That's how many seconds there are in 13.8 billion years. If you find out that a random chance of something happening, like life being created or something, is higher than 10 to the 17th, 1 in 10 in that chance, you're talking about something that is smaller than how many seconds there are in our entire universe. Which means that if something was happening on a random basis, it would have to be happening at least once a second or 2 or 3 times a second. These random mutations or random iterations going on for accidental life to come about. The idea being here is that there's not enough time. And so when we think about this, we're going to look at some examples tonight of some things, and we're going to show you that there is just not enough time. So picture some kind of random mutations going on among some microbes, and they're happening in some kind of a solution, and they're mutating at some kind of a probability, maybe a 50% chance of a good one, 50% chance of a bad one. And they need to do that for 200 consecutive iterations of good, 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 good. That would be a 50% probability raised to the 200th power. 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5, just keep going. That number would end up with 61 zeros after it. That's the chance, 1 in a number with 61 zeros after, that's the chance that that could happen randomly. And what we're going to find is that those numbers are 2 to 3 times larger than the number of seconds that there are in the entire universe, at least according to modern science. So now you're talking about those random mutations would have to be happening 2 to 3 times a second in order for them to even have a shot at becoming life or becoming some kind of a complex system. So what we're going to find is that in just practical sense, you can always take these statements from the evolutionist side and the naturalist worldview and say, you know what, the numbers don't work. The blanket statements are kind of fun. You can throw out things like, oh, we all know that given enough time, everything can happen, right? But no, that's not the case, because if you actually run the numbers, there isn't enough time. In fact, it's a funny thing to say, but there's only 10 to the 17th seconds in the entire universe, only. But that's a huge number. Think about that number.
Yeah. Well, Dave, I think even when I was in school, the number wasn't that high. It wasn't 13.8. It was maybe half of that. So
yes.
How long has that 13.8 been the consensus?
About 2 decades.
Okay.
And think about it. They've been expanding. I don't know about you. I was in junior high in the early 70s, and we were told the Earth and the solar system and all were 3.2 billion years old, and the entire solar system in the universe was about 5 billion years old. And now it's up to 13.8. And what ends up happening is you need more and more time to try to make these things work. And we're going to show you that there's lots of examples whereby no matter, even if you go to the limits of 13.8 billion years, which is 10 to the 17th seconds, nothing can still happen randomly in that amount of time.
So it sounds like, based on what you've said, that number will increase. So in maybe 5 years, the number's going to be 15.8.
Maybe in 5 years, the universe will be 15 billion years old. And maybe in 10 years, they'll say it's 23 billion years old. I mean, it's been going up for quite a long time. But we'll take a break from the numbers for a second. And, Travis, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's called the first cause position.
Yeah.
This is more of a cosmological approach.
Yeah, I think if you need a little break on the math, here I am. Right, so it might be out of the frying pan into the fire. We'll see. But yeah, we're talking philosophy. So one of the things that, if you think about it, right, that much of life, like much of human life and human flourishing is dependent upon us figuring out the cause of things. So if you have a health situation, you got to figure out what's causing that in order to address it. If your car's breaking down or something, right, we got to figure out the cause. Now, causes are not all the same, of course, right? So some causes are caused by something else. So you kind of get this sort of progression of causes. And what the cosmological sort of approach, or this first cause approach, tries to do is to ask, what is the first cause? Because that's really what we're after in much of our, again, pursuits, is to try to figure out what the first cause is. Now, again, this is as old as philosophy is in some ways, right? It goes clearly, easily back to Aristotle, developed by many Christian thinkers along the way, to say that, right, how could you have the universe just be this unending series of causes? There needs to be a first cause to the universe itself, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that today, with contemporary science, we actually have lots and lots of reasons to think. I mean, the fact that we have a number on it, the 13.8 billion years ago, again, you might not buy that number, maybe that number changes, maybe it gets bigger, but as long as it's a number, then we have a finite universe.
Yes.
We have that what happened a finite time ago, could be a very long time ago. I don't know how long a billion is. It seems long to me, right? I've not, survived a billion yet, but right, you can add it up as much as you want, but so long as that there's a beginning to the universe. Let's call that the Big Bang, because I'm guessing when God said, "Let there be," it was, a bang. So call that the Big Bang. There's this massive, I would suggest a massive hole in the naturalist worldview, and that is to answer what caused the Big Bang. How do you explain the Big Bang? If this is the moment in which the universe and all of the, matter, space, time, energy, all sort of springs from this one moment, again, no matter how old we push it back, here's, I think, a fundamental question that every worldview should be able to answer in some way. What caused that? What banged, right? What banged the Big Bang? We need a banger. We need a, I don't know, banger of an idea. I don't know, something like that. There's got to be a way to say that well. What we need, arguably, is a first cause, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle again, and it's this idea of an uncaused cause, an uncaused cause, right? So we have lots, again, like as you're trying to figure out what's going on with your vehicle, or you're trying to figure out what's going on with your health, you're probably only looking at caused causes, right? That could, again, go back and back. And so if we have this infinite regress, the idea is there must be something that began it all. And again, science confirms this, and it's a pretty extraordinary thing. And I just wanted to read this. The reason I'm holding my iPad is just because I wanted to read one verse that, even if you don't buy this, I think it's interesting. This is John 1:1, and John says, "In the beginning was the Word." Now, what's interesting about that are you might think, well, yeah, beginning, okay, I kind of get that. But there's a Greek word here, and it's the Greek word arche, typically translated as beginning. But you don't necessarily see it only as the temporal beginning. What you're trying to figure out is, what's the fundamental stuff that brought all things into existence? That's really this rich Greek word, which goes back all the way to the earliest philosophers. I mean, and they had these kind of hilarious proposals of what, some thought it was water, some thought it was fire, some thought it was turtles, all the way down, that kind of idea. Right? And along comes John saying, I can answer that question. In the beginning was the Word, was the Logos, another really rich sort of Greek term that's in use. Philosophers are thinking about this idea of the logos, right? And saying that our world is created, as he'll go on to say, by this rational principle, by this rational being, by this logos, by the word, right? And then he goes on, though, because he's going to personalize it. He's going to say in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And notice the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him now, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it. Now, here's what gets really interesting. Because again, some of those ideas are going to be there in Greek philosophy. But here's the most extraordinary thing, and I just am sort of throwing this out here as this should at least be seen as interesting. Even if you don't buy it, at least it's like catch how intriguing this is. Verse 14, the Word became flesh. The Word dwelt among us. We observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So I think that's an intriguing answer for trying to figure out what is that first cause, right? What brought it all about? Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a being, and maybe that being came and dwelt among us. Again, you might not buy it, but you should be interested in and sort of intrigued by it. Now let me just relate this to life, and then I'll stop talking for a lot, and you get more math. Right? When we're trying to figure out life, and we're trying to figure out the origin of life, there's this really big, again, this really difficult hole in trying to explain life naturalistically. You really go, when you trace life back, biological life back, you go back and back and back and back, and then at some point it goes from life to non-life, right? This moment that's sometimes referred to as abiogenesis, right? So you see the word a for not, bio for life, genesis for beginning. So you go from non-life to life. And what we don't find are some sort of caused cause, you with me, that brought life into being, a caused cause from non-life. And so what we look for then, what we need is a first cause to life, I want to suggest. Right? This is not a God of the gaps. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. It's not just because we can't explain it. It's because when we're looking for evidence of that requires a first cause, I think that abiogenesis is evidence for it.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably the big beginning of the debate. You know, you can talk about when did things begin, where did they begin, who started it all. And one of the hardest things is to look at supposedly a big bang well, how did that start? Well, they don't have an explanation for that. You'll hear about the theory of singularity. There was just this, infinitesimally small reaction that took place, and then massive explosion, and the universe expanded multiple millions of times in a matter of just 1/32 of a second. And you hear these numbers, but there's no cause. There's no beginning for it. And then what you end up with is all these heavy elements and things like, lead and iron and things suddenly turning into planets, and then somehow along the way they turned into the backbone of life, carbon and oxygen and things. And so, but there's no way to actually provide a basis for what happened. And so one thing I'd like to do is give you an example of something. So this whole presentation is running on my MacBook Air. The MacBook Air has a little over 1,200 parts, separate parts. There's 56 screws just in the keyboard, okay? So all these parts, if you laid them all out and you were a technician and you were going to assemble a MacBook Air from scratch by yourself, it would take you 2 days just manually to put it together by yourself. And there are 63 pages of instructions to walk you through all those steps. So how many of you would ever think that it's logical that a MacBook could just appear randomly over time, that elements would turn into the screws, turn into the retinal display, turn into the video card, the keyboard, the speakers, the wiring, the logic board? I mean, it's ludicrous. But think for a moment where I'm going to go with this. they're going to say it's completely logical that human beings came about that way. But somebody holding up a MacBook at the Computer Electronics Show, when it debuts, would never say, oh, that just randomly appeared out of nowhere, given enough time and random iterations and random opportunities and stuff. So what we end up with is, inside the MacBook is this Intel Xeon processor. It's running at 3.5 gigahertz. Do you know what that means? It means it can do 3.5 billion calculations per second. Okay, a little faster than the chips from the early 80s, right? Think about that. Where did the chip come from? Because the chip is in there providing all the processing power. And again, you'd have to say, well, gosh, we'd have to come up with a model that allows for how all that circuit board and how all the ability to read all the code. Oh, there's another term, the code. What about the information? Because we have this other thing up here called the operating system, Mac OS. Even if the MacBook could come together on its own, just in the universe, just over time, over billions of years, and it could come into existence, how would it run? How would it do anything? It has to have what? An operating system. Where'd the operating system come from? Well, let's take a look at the operating system. 55 million lines of code. Not 55,000, 55 million lines of code. If you printed that out, 2 lines of code per inch on 11-inch paper, it's 426,000 miles of pages. Not 426,000 pages, 426,000 miles of paper. 18 times around the planet. That's the code. Where did the code come from? Did it just come out of nowhere? Of course not. Any logical person would say, first of all, the MacBook didn't just appear one day through random iterations of elements moving through the universe and colliding into each other, and they all of a sudden turned into 56 screws with threads that fell into the holes and screwed themselves down, and everything came together with the chip, and 55 million lines of code to run the whole thing, okay? So here's the problem. A couple of simple models that you can run, we're not going to do those tonight. I do want you to stay for the rest of the presentation. So it comes to about a number you have like a 1 in 10 to the 73rd power. Picture a number with 73 zeros after it, okay? You have a 1 in 10 to the 73rd power chance of just the MacBook coming together on its own. There's a French philosopher, Todd, Émile Borel. Borel came out with the notion as a statistician that anything at 10 to the 50th is impossible. A number of 1 in 10 to the 50th is completely impossible. Of course, they always say, now 10 to the 49th, it could still happen, which is just silly. But think about that. They already have a mentality of 10 to the 50th is the cutoff point. This is 10 to the 73rd, and it doesn't include the code. If you include the code, it goes into something like 10 to the 145th power. Picture a number with 145 zeros after it, and you would have a 1 chance in that number of this happening. It's not possible. In fact, I'll give you another number that'll maybe keep you awake tonight. I hope you're laying in bed tonight and this is going to keep you awake. Most physicists, all in the secular realm and astrophysics, will tell you there are probably in the entire universe 10 to the 80th particles. So protons, neutrons, and electrons are the particles that make up matter. There's probably about 10 to the 80th. So 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, do that 80 times. That's how big the number is, okay? These probabilities are larger than the number of particles there are in the entire universe. And yet we're being told what? Oh, it could happen. It could randomly happen, just given enough time. Oh, wait a second. Given enough time? There's not enough time. How many seconds are there in the entire universe? 13.8 billion years? 10 to the 17th. A MacBook coming around is 10 to the 73rd. That would mean that the random processes would have to be happening about 4 times a second in order for it to happen. And it doesn't even include the 55 million lines of code. So, break from math again. Todd, what do you think?
Well, I think that obviously science can't answer life's ultimate questions. And, you know, we can look at these numbers and it is mind-boggling, literally.
Yeah.
And I look at it and I'm like, wow. And if God could be completely figured out, would I want to believe in that God?
Yeah.
Would I want to worship that God? And we know that Scripture says his ways are mysterious. His thoughts are not our thoughts. But I do think philosophy and theology do answer these deep questions that science cannot. And Travis is going to speak about that a little now. So go ahead, Travis.
So Travis,
Yeah.
are there limits to science?
None. No, there are. No, there are a lot of limits to science. So science is wonderful. Can we just all take a moment to thank? I don't know what we do. We clap. You know, science is wonderful. I mean, think about this room alone. Of all the technology, just to pull off this little event, it's extraordinary amount of technology.
By the way, it all happened randomly.
Just randomly.
Yeah.
Randomly.
No design, no
Dave-
intent,
Dave
no,
did it
no,
randomly.
no
Yeah.
engineering, nothing.
So science is wonderful, and some of us are probably sitting here because of some medical breakthrough or whatever, right? Perhaps address some health condition or something like that in our life. So science is amazing, and it really should be like we should revere science because it has truly pulled off these amazing feats in life. And so this isn't a knock on science. This is just to say that science can't pull everything off, right? There's a view that says that all knowledge should come from science. This is sometimes called scientism. But there's a problem with that, and the fundamental problem with that is that's a philosophical view. Right? You see the problem? Like,
Yeah.
you say, okay, what lab experiment can tell you that science gives us all of our knowledge? There's no science you can do to show you that scientism itself is true. This is an example of a self-refuting view. So I'll give you a couple examples of a self-refuting view, right? This is like if I were to say, I speak no English. It's a problem, right? Because I just spoke that in English. I just refuted myself by the view itself, right? Now, obviously, most of the time when someone says they speak no English, they mean they're not fluent, right? But if I were to say, no, I literally, and I'm saying this in English, I literally speak not one single word of English. Well, that's a big problem. I've just refuted myself by saying that view in English. In the same way of saying that science is the only domain that gives us knowledge, right? That's a philosophical view. There's no scientific evidence you can give for scientism, and it's a fundamentally flawed view. So that's all we're saying then is that there are some limits to science. Like these other domains should speak, have their chance to speak for these sorts of things. So now, oftentimes, another sort of objection that comes along that I referred to earlier is this idea that our Christian views are a matter of the God of the gaps, right? Here's the kind of way it goes. We've got a gap in our knowledge. We don't know how to explain something. Maybe it's lightning. And so we invent a God to plug into that gap. And is it Thor? Is he the god of lightning?
Yeah,
anyway,
sure.
somebody like that. Right? And now, but science now explains what lightning is, and so we don't believe in Thor any longer. And that's the claim, is that like as we go, God's being sort of written out of a job description in some ways. So like he's not playing as much role as he used to play back in ancient times, and science will eventually get us where God plays no role whatsoever. Well, I think that's a fiction. Honestly, that's a fiction, because while we can maybe explain what science is, and I agree, maybe science has shown us that it's not some guy on Mount Olympus, chucking lightning bolts at us or whatever when we get out of line. Science can tell us that. Like we can go up to Mount Olympus and see if there's okay. But what it doesn't explain is the being or the reality of lightning itself. Right? How to understand it now, not physically, but metaphysically. You with me? Where we're understanding it as a reality. It's kind of like how we can understand the combustion engine scientifically, But that doesn't tell us anything about Henry Ford or the inventor or the purpose or what it's there for and so on. We have these metaphysical needs to understand the world as it is. So science will run out, and it will never be able to tell us things about ethics. It doesn't tell us things about purpose. It doesn't tell us things about meaning. And that's why these things fall short on the naturalistic view. You just end up with a universe without meaning. You end up with a universe perhaps without morality. Right? Because science can never tell us. It can tell us like what happens when someone gets punched in the face, but there's no way to tell you, science can't tell you that it's wrong. Science can't tell you when it's right. Those are the limits of science.
Yeah, and if you espouse a naturalist worldview, not only can it not answer life's ultimate questions, but you still have to account for and live your life with theodicy, evil, the problem of evil. It doesn't go away. You still have to live with it. And where's the hope in that? And if you really just try to cling to a godless universe, wow, I'd probably have trouble sleeping at night. I mean, I really would. And what I would do is probably try to numb that fear, that pain with substances or the things that this life could offer, just to numb myself or ignore the reality of the fact that, life expectancy is 76.1 years or whatever it may be. And my wife's grandmother lived to be 103. And I remember talking to her on her 102nd birthday, and I said, Grandma, you lived a long time. You saw the invention of the airplane and the car and the computer and all this. And I said, wow, 102 years, that is a really long time. And she said, yeah, but compared to eternity, it's very short. Mm-hmm. And I said, so what's the answer? And she said, you know what? We'll never have all the answers. She's like, but the one that matters most is this God we've been talking about, that is the artist behind it all, that entered creation to take on flesh so that he could experience everything that any of us would ever encounter. And that was all prophesied hundreds of years before. And when you get into statistics, I mean, just look at those numbers. It's absolutely mind-boggling how this Jesus of Nazareth, a historical figure, unlike the pagan gods, the myths, the Thor, the others that, this is a historical person at a real time and place. And I hope you come back on Friday night, because we're going to be talking about the historical Jesus, evidence for his birth, his death on a Roman cross, and then the resurrection. And Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus wasn't risen from the dead, if he really wasn't God in the flesh, to prove that he was more powerful than sin and death and everything that any of us will ever encounter, we should be pitied. We shouldn't be sitting here right now.
And think about it from an apologetic standpoint. The skeptic would respond to Todd by saying, at the core of my lens, my view through which I see the world, there's this little blue planet just floating through the universe. It's revolving around this certain age sun, one of 8 planets that are circulating it. And they come in sets of 2. So there's 2 in close, there's 2 next, there's 2 more, and there's 2 at the far end. And they came about through no purpose, no intent, no plan, no design, just accidental. And this one planet just happens to have space for life that came about randomly over time. And when you go down that narrative in the typical Nature or National Geographic or History Channel or any kind of a science documentary, these statements are put out there and people just absorb them as, that's right, yeah, it just came about naturally over time. And then over time, there were these little microbes. The microbes turned into things in billions of years, and then they turned into this, and then little fish were swimming, and then they came and they went up on the shore, and they grew legs, and they started walking out of the ocean. You see pictures in the books that show fish with feet, and they're finally coming up on shore. And then, they become dinosaurs, who become birds, who become these things. And you go through Darwin's tree, and you finally come to this place where supposedly chimps turned into this, turned into Neanderthals, and then turned into Cro-Magnon man, and then turned into, hominids, and then hominids ultimately became human. And you follow this narrative, and the narrative has no purpose, no intention, no designer, no first cause. It's just all random. And whenever you keep down that language, you have to come back at some point and say to the other side, what are the numbers? What is the chance of this happening? Because we only have 13.8 billion years for it to happen. And that's only 10 to the 17th seconds. Now, by the way, that's a massive number, 10 to the 17th. Don't picture that as tiny, okay? 10 to the 17th is huge. It's 13.8 billion years. But what we're talking about is the probabilities of these things occurring are larger than the amount of time we have. Let's take another look at some things. When I was in junior high, 1970, we all had to buy the Visible Man. And maybe you had one of these. The plastic lifts off the top and all the organs are in there. You painted them and you learned about the small intestines and the heart and the lungs and everything like that. I'll just make a quick statement. The human body, arguably, has 24 separate systems. Digestive system, a reproductive system, a nervous system, a circulatory system, a respiratory system. I mean, think about it. So it has arguably 24 separate systems that supposedly did what? They evolved simultaneously next to each other over time and interacted with each other so they're fully integrated and ended up with a final human being. The problem with that is at any stage along the way, the intermediate version of those wouldn't function. So how could they possibly all come together in one single system? We've run the numbers, the probability. Oh, by the way, and there's coded information going on in life. It's not just, physical stuff that gets thrown onto this calcium frame, gets wrapped by about 22 square feet of this outside material called skin, but ends up with somewhere around the neighborhood of you have about a 1 in 10 to the 65th chance. So a number with 65 zeros after it, you have one chance in that all those systems could simultaneously come together at the same time. And here's the other problem. There is no intermediate stage of any one of those systems that functions fully. Does that make sense? So if you're halfway along the line to a developed skeletal system, or you're 1/4 of the way along to the respiratory system, or you're 1/3 of the way in evolving into the circulatory system, they aren't going to be able to function. And how will you even have offspring? How will this keep going over time? It just doesn't work. On the upper right-hand side, you see the brain. It weighs about 3 pounds, 73% water. To look at it, if you didn't know what it was, what would you think? It's a sponge, right? Maybe you're going to wash your car with it, okay? Inside it has 100 billion neurons. They are connected by 100 trillion synapses. They have sliced the brain and put it under the microscope to see this. And that's how they figure it's about 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion synapses going on. In fact, the brain handles around 24 petabytes of information. You've heard about a kilobyte, a megabyte, a gigabyte, a terabyte, a petabyte, okay? Give you an idea, there's a scan disk right there. If that's a gigabyte, a 1 gig scan disk, it sells for about $4, $5 at an office store, okay? That 24 petabytes, ready for this, could hold about 40 million hours of movies. Okay? They think that's around 20% of the brain's capacity. Okay? Because you have 100 billion neurons with 100 trillion synapses firing on those. The probability that the information that's going on in there, the coding that's going on in there, at a minimum, for that to have evolved, somehow over time these fibers started connecting with each other and they ultimately turned into the brain. 1 in 10 to the 69th, minimum. How many seconds are there in the entire universe? 10 to the 17th. This number is 4.5 times larger than the number of seconds that there are in the entire universe. How could it possibly have evolved? There's not enough time. Over here we have a skeletal system made of calcium, rigid frame, 231 bones that keep you together, about about 470 different muscles, tendons, and sinews that hold it all together. The probability of that coming together, and they all, by the way, they all fit with each other, and they speak to one another, and they're filled with blood, and they have nervous system connecting them all together. For that to be working, it's about 10 to the 58th is the chance of that happening randomly over time. Now, I'm throwing up some numbers. I hope you know, how big is 10 to the 58th? Do you remember what I told you? How many particles are there in the entire universe? 10 to the 80th. Think about how big a number is. It's 10 to the 58th. You know what that is? That's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. Do that for 58 times. That's how big the number gets. It's not 10 plus, it's 10 times, and the next number is 10 times, okay? How about the ear? Read up on the ear sometime. It's fascinating. Inside the ear, there are these little microscopic cilia. They're like little straws. You can't see them with the naked eye. They fill up with fluid to different levels, and then electrical impulses float over top of them, creating tones. And they then vibrate the eardrum. And it all happens in a fraction of a second. In fact, while I'm talking right now, it's happening in your ear right now. What are you doing to make that happen? Nothing. It just happens. It is so complex, the system that's going on in there, the information that makes it work, minimum 10 to the 57th power. You have a 1 chance in 10 to the 57th. Remember, that's not 10 plus 10 plus 10. That's 10 times 10, then that number times 10, then that number times 10, then that number. Do that 57 times. That's how big the number is. How about the eye? All the rods and cones. Do you realize all that information gets processed in an instant? All of you are using it right now. You're processing, look around the room. You're processing all this light, sound, color, everything instantaneously. And in the eye, the information is being sent down an optic nerve that's smaller than the width of a human hair. And where does that nerve go? It goes into that brain, that 3 pounds of squish. And it goes in there, and you do what? You get to see. Think about it. What's the probability of that occurring? The information on that? Well in excess of 1 chance in 10 to the 63rd power. Again, there is not enough time, and these are if they evolved individually. But now we're talking about what? They have to evolve how? Concurrently, at the same time. So you know what you do with these probabilities? You multiply them times themselves. So you multiply 10 to the 58th times 10 to the 57th times 10 to the 63rd. But you know what the science textbooks tell you? That's how it happened. Just logically over time, it just randomly happened that way. You see a scientist working with a robot. Does that robot look like it was designed or that it just showed up one day out of random chance? It reflects design, right? It looks like somebody worked on it. A whole team worked on it. Look at this one down here, and there's the inventor talking about how it works and so forth. They can't work, just like the MacBook, they can't work unless they have an operating system. Where's the operating system come from? That's code. We're back to the MacBook having 55 million lines of code in the Mac OS. And so here you are now, just to have a robot without a code, just to have a robot, probably 10 to the 72nd power. And so again, now this guy, of course, is a little different robot. He came from the future, okay? Is that too old for some people? Okay. Are you fans of the Terminator at all? Okay, all right, so light. But there's not enough time. There's just not enough time. And we'll close with this one, at least on this section. Robots can be designed, built by a whole team. They can be programmed with software to do things. 10 to the 70th, 10 to the 65th, whatever you want. I mean, it's ridiculous the likelihood it could ever happen on its own. But here's the other problem. 2 robots left alone in a room with some candles and some soft jazz and a nice dinner. You're not going to 9 months later have another little robot, okay? But the human body has the capacity through a microscopic, you can't see it, a microscopic egg and a microscopic sperm from the only 2 versions of people. Those 2 come together, and there's the one version of the human actually is designed inside to carry this little thing that happens, this reaction, this biological reaction, and in 9 months, you get a little child who then grows up to be an adult who can then have other children. And that little thing that took place, that reaction, within 3 weeks, there's a heartbeat. There is electrical impulses going on in the brain. There's the beginning of fingernails. And you know what's inside? DNA. And the DNA strand is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 187,000 miles long at a time when you're only about 2 weeks into conception. And what's in that code is everything about your eye color, your hair color, everything about who you'll be. The DNA coding alone is just mind-boggling to take a look at it. The probability that DNA could come about naturally. In fact, tomorrow, if you're able to be here at 9:30, we're going to take a look at Genesis and creation and the flood. And in the creation side of things, you're going to have to deal with the other side. The skeptic can't handle this. But DNA coding is so unbelievable in terms of its complexity. And yet we're told in the textbooks that it came about when what? Lightning struck a primordial warm pool of water. And instantaneously some proteins burst forth. And they had these complex coding system in them because lightning hit water. And you know what people say when they read the book? They go, sounds good to me. What else you got in chapter 2, right? Okay? But when you stop and think about it, what's the probability? 10 to the 113th. Write out a number sometimes. It's 10 times 10 times 10, that number times 10, that number times, do that for 113 iterations. Take a look at the size. That's the chance that this could happen by random. There's just not enough time. One last thing I'll throw out for tonight, and then we'll have some discussion as we get ready to close, and we'll do some questions. If you took the entire surface of the planet Earth, and every square foot had 500 million microbes randomly mutating in that slosh or whatever they're in. And by the way, we're not even getting to where did the microbes come from. We're just going to give you the benefit of the doubt that there's a planet. The entire surface, every square foot, has 500 million microbes. And most iterations of a mutation result in something that's worse, or it results in death, or something that's not as good. But all the textbooks will tell us that. But think about this. We're going to give you the benefit of the doubt that there's a 50-50 chance that each mutation could turn out good or turn out bad. So you have a 50% chance that as it mutates, it'll turn into something better. So if, in fact, we're trying to get to a simple system like maybe the respiratory system or the circulatory system or the nervous system in the body, you'd have to have about, a minimum, we'd say about 200 functions in order to make that comparable to the human. So what you would do is you would take 0.5 and you'd raise it to the 200th power. You know what that math looks like? 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5. What happens to those numbers? They get smaller because it's half of a half of a half of a half of it. And it goes out to the 200. You end up with a number 6.22 times 10 to the negative 61st. That's a number with 61 zeros after it. There's a 1 chance in a number with 61 zeros. That's the chance that you could have random mutations take place at a rate of 2 or 3 a second with a 50% chance of turning into something good. And over the course of 200 of those in a row, you could get some kind of a basic system. But the problem is what? How many seconds are there in the entire universe? 10 to the 17th. This requires 10 to the 61st. Again, we're going to say, there's just not enough time. Everything from the naturalist worldview, accidental, random, statistical iterations over time, with no purpose, no intention, no first cause, no designer, just we're all here by accident. All of those things are all way beyond how much time we have in terms of the known universe. That means there is not a single scenario by which they could have happened randomly over time. In fact, it's prompted a lot of astrophysicists to now say, you know what? You're right, there isn't enough time. That means life here on Earth must have been brought here from somewhere else. Then you have to stop. It's called transpermia. That's the term they use in the astrophysics. Some distant comet ejected something, and over several million, 100 years or whatever, it passed through our solar system and deposited something on our planet, and that's how we ended up with life. But then the problem with that is what? Where did that come from? Because the universe is only 13.8 billion years. How could that have started somewhere randomly? What do you guys think?
I agree with you. I'm convinced. Yeah.
What does that do for you, Todd, with regard to first cause and with regard to who God is?
Well, like I said before, I can't imagine going through life adopting and living out that naturalist worldview, because inevitably what happens with each one of us is either you're in this room, you're going through a trial right now, or you've recently been through one, or there's one on the horizon. In science, in the naturalist worldview of things, there's no hope.
In fact, they would actually applaud it, because that's the normal thing you'd expect, which is what? Survival of the fittest, just stuff happens.
It's a very existentialist, the existentialism, it's hopeless, it really is. And we all know deep down there's more than that. I mean, we do. This God, back to the scriptures, the heavens declare the glory of God, the one who created all the stars and knows them by name, also created each one of us in his image and knows us intimately and intricately. We're fearfully and wonderfully made, and you just looked at the eyeball and the ear and in the brain and these things that, I look at that and I just marvel, because not only do the heavens declare the glory of God, so does each one of us. Each one of us. And each one of us is on a journey and has a story that God is weaving. And I think a lot of times, if you remember, for those of us that may be over 40 in the room, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, great movie. He said, life moves pretty fast. And, every now and then you should stop and pay attention, or you may miss something. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we come to events like this, and I think that when we open up the scriptures that were somehow inspired by God, that 40 different people over many, many centuries could all write about the one who created it all, mm-hmm. and then would enter into creation to experience anything and everything that any of us would ever deal with. The full range of human emotions, was tempted, truly tempted, because he was fully human, and yet did not sin because he was fully God. The scriptures say that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And to me, as I look at the naturalist worldview versus the biblical worldview, wow, it's kind of like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And Jesus says, if you seek, you'll find. And he says,
interestingly enough, the naturalist, biologist, astrophysicist, who doesn't believe in God in any way, and actually has these blanket statements that they embrace, gets to Travis's point, it's actually an underlying philosophy. Mm-hmm. Think about that. Because if you're going to say, this is how it is, you're in essence creating an absolute truth by your statement, and yet you're trying to make that statement in the context of randomness, and they don't fit. Because when you make the statement that I believe that random chance over time had these things occur, you're actually, whether you like it or not, aren't you making a philosophical comment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, it just shows that it doesn't have to be that we just take these things on blind faith. I don't actually think the Bible ever either tells us to, describes faith as being blind or irrational or anything like that. The most, sort of direct verse on this is Hebrews 11:1, and you're going to see words like assurance, conviction, evidence, substance, right? That it's not telling us just to be irrational. In fact, it's, again, I think the call for Christians is to seek and find, and part of that is going to be an intellectual asking questions. That's what I was thinking about 1 Peter 3:15. It's like it says always be ready, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to be ready.
Right.
But I think how to get ready is just to, in your own life, make that commitment to ask these questions, and the promise that I think each of us would make, I would definitely say, is that you will find answers. Like you will find these reasons. This is not. This is extraordinary stuff. Like you might have a little bit of a headache,
I
given
hope
how
so.
extraordinary it is, right? I was going to ask, like, what's the probability that most people have headaches right now, given the numbers that we've.
Well, you know the story of the astrophysicist who was a skeptic, and in naturalist worldview, he was starting to have a headache listening to Dr. Newton's statistics. So he went to his doctor and he had a CAT scan, and the next morning came back and I asked him, I said, so how did your CAT scan go yesterday? He said, oh, they found nothing. So think about that for a moment. Travis brought up a great point a little while back as we get ready to close here right now. He talked about first cause. And when you think about a first cause, every one of these systems that we're looking at, I mean, the extraordinary intricacy of the design of the human body, this calcium-based frame wrapped in all of these sinews and tissues with these 24 subsystems all folded in over, fitting in this one space, about 6 feet by, foot about probably 6 square feet, cubic feet here. And it's wrapped in like 22 square feet of this exterior skin. Mine's not doing so well. It's into the late 60s here in terms of its age here. So, but it's still hanging on for a little while, right? Okay. But think about that. All of those things coming together, the scientists can still not tell you the first cause. If you keep, as you said before, Travis, you keep going back and back and back and back, where do you get to the starting point of something so simple that turns into something so incredibly complex? And would anybody ever walk through a science expo and see modern robots and computers and all kinds of advanced machinery and drones and look at it all and say, what? Just happened by chance? None of these things exhibit design. Nobody worked on them. There's no specifications and drawings and schematics, and there weren't teams that put these together and came up with how they're going to be constructed, and there isn't software running them, and there isn't code that was written in order to do all the functions. No, it just happened. No one would ever say that about machinery. Look around this room. Does it look like it happened by accident, or did somebody design the space? It was designed, okay? No one would ever say it just happened. And yet we're willing to do what? We're saying to human beings came about randomly. And we use these blanket statements, and if you go and look at the numbers to see if they can actually happen, the reality is every one of those comes out at a probability that's smaller than 1 in the number of seconds that there are in the known universe. So, what we'll close with is some common questions. Now, rather than opening up the floor and passing a mic around, what I like to do at these things is to do some questions that we have. So, Travis, I like your question. Why don't you start with yours? What's a typical, we each came up with what we think are the classic questions that people like to ask. And when we finish this up, we'll be available down, we'll come down to the stage. We're happy to talk with you one-on-one and answer more questions if you'd like to. But I love your first question.
Okay, so my question that I thought might be swirling out there is, if this seems so compelling from a certain vantage point, right? And so, but why are there so many atheists still? And especially, why are there so many atheists who are scientists? Because it is, you look at the sort of statistics, and it's disproportionately high amongst scientists. Now, one response is to say, well, certainly not all scientists are. And there's actually, I think, I've got some friends that are in the science world, and there are extraordinary things going on in the science world, and that there is those things shifting where more and more people are kind of seeing this kind of evidence and finding it quite plausible. I got to think that there's also part of it is that science just gives us so many things. Again, like the point that we're just surrounded by technology, and I don't even just mean the video and the amplification and lights and things, but our chairs, our clothing. I mean, we are just literally clothed in technology and the deliverances of science. And I do think that there's a way in which somebody can kind of get a little tunnel vision on that and just think that's all we need. We don't have room or space for God. That sounds like a unscientific sort of thesis, right? You with me? So I think there is that sort of push when someone sort of stares at the science where they sort of don't feel like there's a need for that. But again, if someone could take a step back and kind of ask the big philosophical questions and realize that science really falls flat in answering the big sort of worldview questions and why are we here and what is the purpose of life and why is there so much, as Dave was laying out, like this sort of intentionality with all these things coming together just perfectly and so on. And then I think the last thing that I would say is that I think that there is also the reality that, so I'll tell a quick story, that there's a debate that I got to see between William Lane Craig, who's a famous Christian philosopher, and Sean Carroll, who's a famous atheistic, I think he's a physicist. Or something like that. And they're going back and forth, and the topic of the debate was, does science point to God? And of course, William Lane Craig is defending the yes, and Sean Carroll is saying no, but they kept kind of like seeing it as a tie. There was nothing in science that really pushed, really it was sort of a tie. Like you could see it naturalistically or you could see it theistically. And for Sean Carroll, it came down to the fact that there's evil, pain, and suffering in the world, which I just thought was so interesting that that's a philosophical issue. That's
right.
Really not a issue of science. And again, like as Dave mentioned, on naturalism, you really sort of would expect there to be pain and suffering all over the place because it's survival of the fittest and that kind of a thing. And so presumably then, if we could give a good answer to the problem of evil, problem of pain and suffering, then, right, then science does point to God in a way. Like, it should point to a designer. Sean Carroll's point was just to say the world as we find it is just very flawed. It doesn't seem to be what a perfect God would give us, right? But of course, we have a Christian answer to that claim, that ultimately it comes down to the fallenness of humanity and our sinful choices and things like that. Right. And anyway, there's a lot larger answer. We could spend the next hour talking about the problem of evil, of course, but and I won't. But I think if we do have a good answer for that, and I think we do, then I think we could help address, again, some of that as scientists, I guess, are looking at their science and just saying this is not the sort of God theistic world that we might have expected.
And a classic question from the other side, typically the scientists I've debated over the years and talked with, is people like yourselves would always ask, well, here's the classic question, how does a typical skeptic respond to such absurdly large, ridiculous statistical probabilities that just could never happen? And the reality is they don't respond. They skirt them. And I'm not saying that in a smug kind of manner. I'm just saying when I've been head-to-head and had the math on the screen, my calm response has always been, can we stop talking about your philosophy about these things? Can you just tell me, is my math off? Are my numbers okay? Do the numbers make sense? And they're looking at them and they're thinking, yeah, they do make sense, but you can't make that statement. Because as soon as you make the statement that, Newton, your numbers make sense, you've then completely undermined their philosophical position, which is that everything came about by random chance. See, that statement, everything came about by random chance, is a nice blanket statement. But if you're really a scientist, wouldn't you want to peel that apart a little bit and try to figure out if it can hold any value? just before we dismiss you tonight, again, we'll be down here to take some questions, talk with you one-on-one. I want to be sensitive to the fact that you have to pick up kids from childcare and it's getting late. But tomorrow at 9:30, we're going to take a look at the book of Genesis. Is it literal factual history, or is it myth, allegory, and metaphor? Is it legend? Is there anything in there that's truthful, the book of Genesis? And what about the creation account, and what about the flood of Noah? Aren't those just bedtime stories, just kind of things that make us feel good, or is it factual history? And so we'll be doing that tomorrow right here at 9:30, same format. And then as Todd said, on Friday night, we'll be in here at 7 o'clock, and we'll be looking at a really crucial topic. Is there any evidence, aside from the Bible, is there any evidence for the historical Jesus? And what is the evidence for that? And if the evidence is there, what kind of things come out of that particular topic? How about one last question, Todd? What would you say is a great question that somebody would ask?
Yeah, and I actually asked this of someone, and I'll tell you the context of it. A friend of a friend, they invited me to this barbecue, and the guys had been there for a few hours before me. They had, been throwing down some brews, and they were pretty well inebriated or whatever by the time I got there. And I knew this one guy that was there, Ivy League educated, skeptic, was a book critic for a major national paper. And anyways, everybody left except for my friend and this skeptic. And so he's kind of a little bit of slurred speech. And he says, "Oh, so you're a priest?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not a priest." and anyways, he said, "Well, why do you believe in God?" And so I said, "Well, ask me whatever you want." So for like 30 minutes, he asked me questions about the problem of evil and just the classic questions. And I tried to have a sense of humor, and I've answered. And then I said, "Can I ask you some questions?" And he goes, "Absolutely. You were patient. You were respectful. It's your turn. You can ask me whatever you want." And so this question I asked of him, I would ask of anyone, and this may be for those of you who are Christians in the room and you want to engage someone in dialogue that might hold a naturalist worldview, is I said, have you ever had anything in your life happen that you cannot explain by natural causes? And what I mean by that is, and I know you don't want to go there because you don't believe in God, but if you had to label it, it was supernatural. He looks at my friend, he looks back at me, he goes, "What the hell, I'll tell you." And he said, one of our children, our daughter at age 23, died 2 years ago. And we were shocked, and we're still grieving. And he said, we didn't even know what to make of it. And we had her funeral, and our friend was there, and it was a beautiful service, and I miss her, and I think about her every day. And he said, but a couple weeks after her death and the funeral service, my wife and I got the call that her tombstone was ready. So it's a beautiful sunny day, and we just us, there's no one else around. And he said, so we get out of the car, and we can see the tombstone, and where the fresh dirt was still there, and we walk over, and her name comes into focus on the tombstone. And he said, and we're just both just kind of nervous, and just sad. And he said, and all of a sudden my phone rang. And I looked down at my phone, and my wife looks down at my phone, and he says, there's no number. And he said, our daughter is on our phone, like almost a FaceTime call. And she is as alive as she's ever been. Her hair is blowing in the wind. She's smiling. And we're just looking at the phone, and it's ringing, and we're trying to, nothing. And it was right as they're standing at her grave. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I tried to answer the phone, but it. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, she knew we were there. I'm convinced of that fully, that she knew we were there. So yeah, the answer to your question, yes, that happened, and I think it happens to all of us if we're honest about it. And so that's just a question I would leave. If you've got someone that just ask them that question, and you see what story comes up, and it's either an angel did something or something else. But when you get at the heart of who we are as humans, and we all have these hurts and unpredictable things in life that we have to cope with, whether we believe in God or not.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would just leave you with tonight, because I think you can all relate to what I just said.
On the video, when it's finally posted and stuff, you'll always be able to go back and take a look at this screen. Here's a couple of recommended readings that we'd pass your way. Certainly not an exhaustive list. There's some great resources out there. But I encourage you that if this kind of topic kind of prompts you to think and really kind of makes you inquisitive, that's a good thing. And we want you to get to a place where you spend some time looking at the evidence, and hopefully get to a place too in your Christian life where you say, you know what, when the other side presents things in such what seems like such a black and white, cut and dry, it's a done deal. Evolution happened. We're not here with any purpose. Stop for a moment and recognize that that's just one philosophical position from the naturalist skeptic. It's an opinion. It doesn't have fact that backs it up. And I think tomorrow you'll see we're going to take a look at 7 supposed axioms of science, things that are just assumed in all the science textbooks. Everybody just assumes that these are axioms that we all agree to. And we're going to take a look at the fact that many of those have literally zero empirical scientific evidence to back them up, but they are still pushed in all the textbooks as being the core way of viewing things. And we'll take a look at the creation account. We'll take a look at Noah's Ark. Is that silly to believe in a global flood? And we'll take a look at evidence on both sides of that and how to read Genesis. And so that'll be our topic for tomorrow morning. Hope to see you then. And then Friday night, we'll be taking a look at the historical Jesus. We do have some books out in the lobby that if you're interested in, you can do some more kind of focused reading on some of these areas. Really grateful to have Travis and Todd here. If you notice, Todd from Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, he does not have a New Jersey accent, okay? And not yet. But we're looking forward to being back here again tomorrow and then on Friday evening. And we'll be down in front to chat with you and you can ask any other questions that you'd like, okay? So thank you very much for coming this evening.